Good afternoon, Hugh. It was nice to hear from you today. And I've enjoyed much of what I've seen that you have written over the past couple of years, and including your recent posts about helping your child, your son, I believe, his homework during this coronavirus situation. So I do have a couple questions for you if you're up for it. I believe we have similarly aged children. Mine are about to be 7 and 10. So I guess my question would be this, and I'll keep it nice and broad so you could take it any way you'd like. To what extent and in what ways has your study or your familiarity with Vygotsky's work influenced your experience as a parent, be it the way that you have reacted to things or maybe ways that you have proactively tried to get ahead or influence things, really in any which way at all. And by all means, if you have any tips or any advice whatsoever, I'm absolutely interested. So thanks. And by the way, sorry about the lighting and the setting. I'm out of the house for a couple days, so on the road. So thanks.
Hello, Anthony, and anyone else watching. I've got your question on a card, and I've got some notes. I'm expecting this will be about half an hour. There'll be about 10 minutes preamble describing Vygotsky's influence on my thinking, and then 20 minutes going much more into anecdotes and my insights into certain aspects of children's behavior and parenting. Okay, let's start with your question. Again, our subject is parenting and Vygotsky, which is a very large subject indeed. But hopefully I will touch upon some meaningful things in the time that I've put into this. Okay. To what extent and in what ways has your study or your familiarity with Vygotsky's work influenced your experience as a parent? Be it the way that you have reacted to things, or maybe ways that you have proactively tried to get ahead, or influence things really in any which way at all. So yes, these are good points, and I have answers to each of these nuances. But first, the preamble. Okay. So we can talk about Vygotsky in the narrow sense, in terms of what Vygotsky wrote and the studies and work that Vygotsky did. Or we can talk about Vygotsky's ideas and the Vygotskyan school and all the collaborators that extended or took his ideas and perhaps even took them in new directions within a certain domain. And it's in the second sense that I generally think of as being Vygotsky or Vygotskyan. I like to try and read between the lines and not worry too much about the explicit wording of things. Partly that's because I rely on translations, which for me have been very beneficial. I mean, I wouldn't have come into contact with this material otherwise. Okay, so that wider sense still, I would say, is true to Vygotsky in the sense that we're talking about psychological development, and in my case, a particular interest in developmental education. And I'll get more into what I mean by developmental education as I proceed. So a little bit more on influence. Vygotsky helped me to build a conceptual structure around some ideas that I was pursuing, some conceptual problems. So he didn't change my way of thinking or way of looking at things necessarily, but certainly added some important conceptual structure into ways of understanding and insights into behavior. Now, this generally can be described as the externalist method or externalist school of psychology. And what this is referring to is basically methods you could take in order to make very strong inferences about the nature of someone's inner world. So you're not relying upon self-report or subjective experiences. You can actually get highly rigorous studies using particular methods to report on something that appears to be a complete black box that you have no access to. So that those ideas were for me very rich and insightful, and I resonated with much of what Vygotsky was writing about and had to say, and I was reading from the same page, as it were, as my own thinking was developing. So a key theme with Vygotsky is the social genesis of mind. And different people take this in different ways. Okay, some people are talking about social practice, other people are looking at the linguistic aspects, or anthropological, psychological, or as we subject of our talk today is just participation as a parent, or as in your own occupation as a teacher. We all have things to gain from Vygotsky, I think, and it's a really lovely subject that enables people with different interests to actually come together and sometimes even agree on what they're seeing and talking about. So, social genesis of mind is one of these subjects that is foundational to Vygotsky. And some of these practitioners focus more on this, on the social practice side, and less on Vygotsky's emphasis on the development of cognition. That, to some people, takes more of a back seat. For me, that's much more in the foreground. And in fact, personally, you can relate, for me, I relate social genesis of mind quite closely with the notion of metacognition. Now, metacognition is a term that was bandied around quite a lot when cognitive science was in its infancy or earlier days, and I don't know whether the connotations that people had then are the same now, but certainly the phenomena that it refers to is still alive and kicking, and it would be foolish, in my opinion, to ignore it. Other phrases that you might use instead of metacognition might be reflectiveness or reflexivity. It's largely pertaining to thought turning around upon itself, or just self-awareness. And for me, this is very important with respect to my own studies and research, and also as I relate it to Vygotsky. Okay. So when I'm reading Vygotsky, it's not just about Vygotsky's ideas and theory and their coherence, it's also important for me that it's something that I can relate to, that I can use to think about my own experiences and scrutinize what Vygotsky says in relation to my own experiences or what I observe with others and different accounts. So we have to we can make it personal, have a personal basis to these understandings, which of course is very important when we're talking about being a parent and any insights that we can bring to our engagement with children. It's an important point. Many people emphasize that psychological development and developmental education pertains to children and doesn't have much to do with adults. For me, that doesn't apply at all. I would say no, it's something that just continues on. The only difficulty really is talking about psychological development with respect to adults, because it's more of a touchy subject, and it's far easier ethically to talk about children's development, because everyone is happy to accept that children start off with relative to adults fairly poor performance at some things, and they learn and develop and blossom in what they do. But it's not so easy to talk about these things with respect to adults, because it opens the door to all sorts of criticism and scrutiny and comparisons. But from my position, everything that's written about here with respect to children can apply to adults too. So it's not only learning about how to be a good parent with respect to children, you can apply it to your own practices and your own endeavors. Okay. So we need to because I'm emphasizing developmental education and my efforts to try and shoehorn this in somewhat to my parenting role, I need to help distinguish what we mean by development. Now, reading between the lines of what Vygotsky wrote, even in his first volume, or rather what's collated into his first volume of the collected works, we have a very small amount of text, about 4 lines, that describe, or the first instance of description, I think, of the zone of proximal development. And there's just 4 lines that describe it quite succinctly. And here he talks about 2 notional children, each having the same intellectual age, and by this he means the upper complexity with which these children are currently able, upper complexity of an activity or task that these children are able to undertake independently. And so this is given an index called intellectual age. And he says, well, if you've got these 2 children that are apparently equivalent at undertaking some task that for them is at the higher ends of their complexity, or their ability to handle a certain degree of complexity, you take these 2 children with the same intellectual age and you give them a harder task, but with assistance from an adult, then these 2 children may perform in quite qualitatively different degrees. One child, he says, could perform at a level that's 1 year higher than their current, i.e. they're now performing, with the aid of an adult, they're performing a task that it would take a 9-year-old, if they were previously 8, a 9-year-old to, if their age is 8 and the comparison is against a 9-year-old, and the second child might perform perhaps equivalent to a child who's undertaken the activity independently that was 12 years old. And so there might be effectively a 4-year gain with the assistance of an adult. Perhaps I should have read the passage, because it would have been a lot shorter than my roundabout way of describing it. Now, this little section helps to locate some ideas, but it doesn't actually point out what's going on in this structure. It just says something's happening here that seems to be important, right? But the actual passage itself doesn't say, well, what actually is it that's important here? You have the social aspect here, in which is saying, well, the adult's contribution enables the children to do better at a task, and this helps to show certain skills or competencies that the children have available to them in some early form that can manifest with the help of an adult, or a particular adult. And these two children are able to perform at different levels with respect to each other, which suggests that one child has something different about them to the other one with respect to the task. Again, the actual description doesn't refer to at all about what is actually different here. It's just identifying it. It's locating a phenomena, and for our purposes to start with, that seems a good place to start. I mean, the description itself has all sorts of issues with it. You could say it's naive in certain respects, but it helps to locate a focus of attention. Now, in this, you'd have to read much more Vygotsky to really start to appreciate what sorts of things is Vygotsky interested in making this description. So one child has a sort of 4-year gain, and the other has a 1-year gain. What's going on? Why is this the case? We can assume that the guidance given by the adult is comparable, or even you could even say that the adult will just communicate whatever they feel necessary to the child, and will just say, to enable the child to do as best as they can, and still only one will get 1 year's higher in terms of complexity, and the other 4. So, well, one way to think about this is in terms of instruction that we can give and allow people to carry out. So I could say to one of my children, we're going to be talking about migration of birds today. Why don't you go and find out some information about birds and maybe write a page about migration? I could give that as a task, or I could say to my child, in an instructive capacity, if I'm, in a teaching role, go on the internet and look up bird migration and have a look around and write a page about it. Or I could say to a child, go go and sit at the table and bring up Google on the browser and use the keywords bird migration and see what you can find. Or I could say, go and sit at the table, turn on the computer, bring up the browser, go to Google, and bring the mouse to the top of the URL, or sorry, into the search box, and type in BIRD space MIGRATION. So you get my gist. But I can have different levels of direction or instruction or guidance, and children may be responsive to some, but some of the others they might not be able to follow. And I would suggest that this is quite commensurate with what Vygotsky is focusing upon when he's talking about the zone of proximal development, and which his emphasis is upon the child's ability to imitate. And I would say, well, these are two very similar things, except when I'm talking about degrees of generality in instruction, this helps to draw one's attention to certain qualitative differences within a set of instructions that ostensibly are about the same thing. So a child can follow some and not necessarily follow others, or perhaps I start with some high generalization and then I emphasize on a few bits and pieces. This helps to draw out the distinction of how an activity can be structured. And this structuring of an activity you can talk about in terms of a method or even one strategy. And I would suggest that this strategy or method is very important and central to all of Vygotsky's work and to Vygotskyan process, Vygotskyan school, particularly within the developmental education line. So what do I mean by, or what do we mean by development as opposed to learning? And within the context of development of cognition, what I'm referring to is the reorganization of cognition. Particularly, for example, the reorganization of cognition to enable greater complexity of strategy or ways of structuring one's activity, including ways of synthesizing better, more complex ways to perceive, appreciate, understand. All these things can be mediated by this relative degree of complexity of structuring of one's activity. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this in this talk. When I'm talking about cognition, I'm not talking about something separate to activity. I'm talking about an aspect of activity, and that aspect is the guiding aspect of one's activity. Now, this isn't necessarily something that always takes place within one's activity, because you could be doing something that's extremely familiar and not require much conscious thought about it. So, but historically, conscious thought would have been necessitated in learning that activity to begin with. So the cognitive guidance that takes place within an activity is something that requires conscious attention, i.e. the thinking on the part of the actor, whether it's a child or an adult or anyone else. So this for me is something that distinguishes between learning and development. You can learn how to do things, for example, go on a course and get training to do certain things, but that training doesn't necessarily involve thinking about the nature of the problem that you're doing and actually thinking about how you're doing it and whether the way that you're doing this activity is the most effective way. Often you can go on a training course and they will have might have a prescribed way of undertaking an activity, which could be a highly efficient way of doing it, but they're not necessarily focusing upon reorganizing the way that you do things, or even more important, encouraging you as an active agent in the process to reorganize your own ways of thinking and doing things, which I would suggest is actually, the nub of the matter. It's the really important part. You could have someone else reorganize your structure of your doing things, but you wouldn't have the same qualitative degree of agency over it. If you came across a new activity, you still might have dependence upon others, whether it was cognitive dependence or emotional dependence or just interest or desire to go through some transformative process with respect to certain activities. So the development's about the reorganization of your cognition, and it doesn't just pertain to isolated activities necessarily. We can talk about activities much more generally. So there are degrees of in the teaching world use the term transference, and so this is a good way to bring in developmental ideas into the teaching world, because you say, well, if you have a developmental focus, then it's all about transference. It's all about learning to be able to understand what you are doing, think about what you are doing, whatever it is you're doing. So you could call it deep learning or deep ways of understanding. But if you're going to draw a neat distinction, I would suggest that the reorganization of the structure of one's thinking and activity is the key difference. Now, Vygotsky doesn't write about that in an explicit fashion the way that I'm writing about it, because I'm reading between the lines. There's other material that I'm bringing in to refer to this, but I would suggest he does get there in a roundabout way. Okay, I think that's most of the preamble. Right. No, there are a little bit more things. There's one more thing I wanted to talk about on the preamble. Right. So, if you're talking about anything significant or profound in the world of psychology, generally involves personal accounts of things, and the same applies here, I think. So, in order to try and give concrete examples and anecdotes, which I'm going to do, they're going to be personal ones, and so this requires that I share some intimate aspects of at least my own experiences and family experiences, which I wouldn't normally do. But I think this is important in order to try and convey some of these ideas quite concretely, and I think they're important ideas. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so like yourself, I've got two children, two boys, 1 6, 1 9, and I've been interested in developmental psychology for quite a while. So the ideas and interests have been growing along with the experiences and joys of parenthood. If I was going to date it, I think it's probably about 10 years that I've been looking into Vygotskian ideas and relating to them to other forms of theorizing psychology, and also the systemic ideas that can relate to this as well, in the form of systems thinking, cybernetics, and that sort of thing. Okay, so your question's originally about whether this has brought out certain degrees of emphasis in my parenting. I would say yes. They've certainly encouraged me to engage with the children in particular activities, and encourage the children to engage in certain activities, and also help to give some leniency, I think, as well, to some of their activities, which perhaps I wouldn't necessarily have seen in such a wider context. There's some things I might think, well, they could be doing something better with their time, for example, and maybe perhaps giving more scope for questioning that. I would say also that the whole appreciation for development is giving me more time, or has encouraged me to spend more time observing and participating with children, with my children. It's a very important point, I think, here when we're talking about engagement and working with children, in that whenever we can participate in such a way that it isn't just for the child's benefit, or that that it's meeting the child's interests, but if it's also meeting the adult's interest too, then that's when some really good quality experiences can arise from the experience, whether it's reading a book or doing a task together. So I think that's quite important. I mean, you can, obviously, if a child's very interested in the book and you think, oh gosh, that tedious book, I'm gonna have to, work my way through it, and so you just do it. Of course, that's going to happen. But when you can, if you can arrange the situation so that it's something that you have a joy for, then obviously that joy is going to come through, and the children are going to pick up on that. So your emotional aspect, I think, is very important. It comes through in your voice, the whole behavior, how you, the tempo, everything. It brings so much more color to the experience. And the ideas that Vygotsky and many others bring to these accounts of children's development in themselves can help you as an adult just get a deeper appreciation of all the wondrous phenomena that's going on before you, and can really draw you in more, and just help bring those encounters to a higher qualitative encounter. And that's got to be for the good. Okay. Now, I talked about development, social genesis, and metacognition. And this all comes together as a parent, particularly with a very young child, like pre-verbal, in what you might call an auxiliary mind. So in this case, you can think of yourself as an adult as being an adjunct to the child's own capabilities, And if you can so fashion your own contribution so that you don't interrupt a child's own thinking process, but support it. So like you're an extra layer, if you had a topographical model of what was going on. So you can appreciate what they're trying to do, their orientation to what they're doing. Almost put yourself in their shoes, see what they're trying to do, if that can be done, if you can achieve that. And then be able to, if the timing's right or if it's an apt moment, you might be able to provide some extra guidance or structure to that activity, so that you are supporting them in that activity. And this then feeds in, of course, this directly applies to Vygotsky's social genesis of mind. Now, thinking of how to bring this forward. In some respects, this is just introducing the child to more experiences, things they might not have thought about. But in terms of this developmental process, you can think about the adult's contribution, if it's done in harmony, can act as a reflective process upon what the child themselves is doing, and also a guiding process. And this, especially with a pre-verbal child, can have a great deal of bearing upon, for example, their appreciation of vocabulary and speech, and because as the parent, I would suggest you have a high degree of influence with the child with respect to your own way of enunciating. So as parents, I would tend to think that your accent, your way of pronunciation, enunciation, emphasis, all these things are very particular for the child, that they're going to pick up on, and they'll learn these patterns quickly and also start to adopt them themselves. So when they're learning, when they start to imitate and use the vocabulary that you yourselves are using, they're probably going to be using it in very similar ways, and even structure and pronounce it the same ways. Okay, let's move on to some examples. So I started here with some examples from my children before they could speak. Okay, and some of the things that I would just do with them. So some mostly little games and things like that. So one of them, for example, is quite simple, and that's encouraging their agency and to observe what happens when they do particular things. So one of them would just be, for example, if I picking up the child to a higher height, my chest height, and pointing out a light switch to them and encouraging them to turn the light switch on and off and look up at the light and see it come on and off. And for both my children at a certain age, they once I'd shown them this, they loved it, and they keep doing it and want to see it. And it's just simple activities like this can really help to show their agent to get a child sense of agency. And I think it's such a simple thing that they can do from quite an early age, certainly before they're talking. In terms of appreciation, there's a nice little example, I think, where if you can really enter into the child's world somewhat or understand their orientation, I think this would count as a nice example of it. And that is when one of my children was still pre-verbal, I think, and he was next to a piece of furniture, a sofa with a gap underneath it, but only a gap of a couple of inches under the sofa. and he had a toy in his hand, and he pushed the toy underneath the sofa, and he looked at me, okay, and then he made some gesture, I think, and then he brought that toy back out again. Now, it perhaps wasn't framed with the same kind of silence that I'm giving it, but for me that was very clear at that point in time that he was demonstrating to me that he had discovered that you can make an object disappear and then bring it back again. So it's like a little piece of magic, and he'd shown me that, and our understanding together of that he had shown me that could really make a qualitative improvement in our, or at least demonstrative of the level of communication that we could have. It wasn't that I was just thinking, oh, he's got his toy and he's just doing stuff with it, but he was actually showing something very significant that was happening in his world, that he could show that to me even without the use of speech. So I think that was an example of how you can enter into the world of the child and really gain some close harmony with what they're doing, and appreciate that there's a lot going on, and it's ostensibly everyday, very simple activity, but at the same time very profound, that is making this discovery. There's another account which I love, and again, this is one of my children. It's pre-verbal. I think maybe I've written notes about it somewhere, but I couldn't find them before talking. Somewhere between 15 and 18 months old, and he wasn't talking at that time, and but I got the sense that he was perhaps following certain things that we were saying. So one day, I called him to me, and I said to him, "Can you please put my boot on the trolley and bring it to me, please?" Now, when I asked him this question, I didn't look at the objects, and I deliberately didn't make movements with my hands or in any other way try to communicate what it was that I asked him to do. So, young child waddles off, goes to where one of my boots is lying, puts it on his little toy trolley, and trundles over with the trolley. And for me, that's just an amazing thing, because here we are ostensibly thinking, well, the child can't speak yet, he doesn't understand language, and yet I've asked him to do something that he's never had me boldly making a request of him before in this way before, and yet he's perfectly willingly carried it out and demonstrated that yes, he can understand what I'm saying. I think that's quite a lovely account. So the kind of things I would also encourage, similar to the light bulb, the light switches, is just manipulation of objects. And one of the boys particularly, they really, again at the pre-verbal stage, he loved playing with peg puzzles. And peg puzzles are just like a wooden board with cut out holes, particular shapes, and you just have to put the shape into the right hole. But this is, of course, isn't trivial for a child that's under 2 years old, and they have to manipulate shapes and remember which one goes up. But one of the children, he loved this and became very versatile at it. And in fact, I would suggest that actually helped to set in motion a whole progression that has continued right through to this day. There's certain things that he loves to do. Other things at pre-verbal stage, there was plenty of pointing involved. Again, this is all pre-speech. when it was getting close to bedtime, or even sometimes in the middle of the night, if they'd wake up, when they're having, when they're tired or fretful, and there was crying involved, sometimes I would just, I would play a little game with them in which I would pick them up, and I'd take them downstairs, and I'd walk around with them. I'd be carrying them around, and the child would point out where to go. So basically they would have the magic finger, and wherever they pointed, I would take them. And then we might turn around and go somewhere else. And it was just, a fun game that they enjoyed, and was a good distraction from the growing pains that they were probably going through. So these are all little anecdotes that hopefully you can start to relate to some of the things that Vygotsky is talking about. I know he largely talks about speech, but all these little discoveries and activities that are happening even at a pre-verbal stage are just very important, and can perhaps lay a foundation for more sophisticated activities when they get older. And as a elaboration upon that, when I was talking about peg puzzles with one of the children, and I was talking about a continuity, certainly with him there was a progression from an interest in the peg puzzles to playing with Lego. First of all, the larger pieces of Lego, and then smaller pieces, and also with puzzles, normal jigsaw puzzles. In fact, probably the jigsaw puzzles first, actually. Yes, normal jigsaw puzzles that maybe 10 pieces in the puzzle. He loved working with the jigsaw puzzles, because I think certainly with the social emphasis upon it, and it just being for him a loving experience that he could enjoy doing and learning with these things. So he progressed from working with jigsaw puzzles, and then getting different Lego kits and putting lots of Lego together as an extension of the jigsaw puzzles, but still having interest in the puzzles. Progression from the Lego to building things in virtual environments. So, for example, there's this kind of virtual Lego, and there's the Minecraft and things like this. And also progression on to looking at things like family trees. I would also see there's a continuity into this family tree structure. So, right from the early stages of just enjoying putting little pieces of wood into these boards of these peg puzzles, I can see there is a continuity that I can perceive as an adult, and parent, and a psychologist too, coming right the way through to his enjoyment of working with more abstract ideas, for example, with the family trees that he's worked with. And the kind of, when I say family trees, and I'm talking about graphs with about hundreds of interconnecting names and lineages and other details. And in the work that I've done with him as teacher substitute for over the COVID times, also have expanded that into other kinds of graphs, which he's enjoyed too. Okay, moving on. Right. Yes, so in addition to appreciating what the child is trying to do at any particular time and their scope, which I call orientation, their active orientation, there are other Vygotskian phenomena or phenomena that people in the Vygotsky world refer to, which they're talking about things like negative phases in their development or crises, and certainly an appreciation of Vygotskian ideas can help you as a parent work through these, depending upon the stubbornness or resilience of the children that you have. So I had some experience of these phases. I mean, more so perhaps with one of the boys than the other. And I recall that this was a subject that we talked about on XMCA a good while ago, and I was drawing attention to different interpretations, for example, of Leontief, saying that these crises aren't necessary to actually experience or go through, or you can interpret it that way. They aren't necessarily a crisis in terms of a lot of trouble or a big shock that one has to experience. You can think of it as a logical crisis in the sense that there's a change, a big change taking place. Now that change doesn't necessarily have, I think, doesn't necessarily have to entail a huge upheaval, huge emotional upheaval, although sometimes it may be necessary and can help with this. But as a parent, if you can appreciate that this is an important dynamic in the development of your child, then you're not necessarily going to fight it. You know, when your child is complaining about something, and you know, from your practical involvement in whatever it is, you might think what the child's doing is absolutely ridiculous. That all you're trying to do, for example, is take a shortcut, or do some routine activity in a slightly different way, and or even try and do it in the way that it was done before. And a child is, you know, screaming that no, you need to go back and do it the other way. You're going to be less inclined to just, you know, put your foot down and say, no, we haven't got time, do this. You might, you know, have more time and reflective opportunity to say, okay, you know, everything's a learning process and activity, and for the child, in terms of the way they understand the world, this is how things need to proceed with respect to either their familiarity or their new ways of appreciating the situation. So you can think of it in terms of there's good reasons for them to be obstreperous or obstinate in this so-called negative phase. There's quite a few examples I think I can think of that. For example, yes, when one of the children was being pushed around in the buggy, there was a certain sequence of events that would have to take place when they came indoors. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it might have been, for example, that they don't get out of the buggy until they're in the house, or that the clip comes off first and then they're released from the buggy, or basically a certain script that would have to take place. And for this particular heightened phase, there was a lot more resistance to certain things happening a certain way. So you just say, okay, let's rewind, and you know, literally have to actually put everything back up together again, put them back in the buggy and go out the door and then come back in again, and they might be happy with that. And otherwise you might be putting up with another half hour or hour, or maybe even longer of them complaining loudly. Yeah, so here's a nice example of what you might think of as a negative phase, or certainly rejection of something. And that's with one of the children when at one point he took exception to having baths, and he wouldn't get in the water in the bath. This was largely with with his mum, and she was telling me about this for many weeks, maybe a month. He was complaining, or maybe longer, that he was saying no, he'd something about the bath that he'd just taken exception to, and he wasn't going in, not without a big fight. And it would probably be just me, more than it was worth to force him into having this bath. So one has to appreciate that the child's understanding of the situation is going to be different to ours, and you can relate perhaps this to the preconceptual understanding that Vygotsky would theorize about the child, and think, well, if the child approaches this in a different context or a different way of looking at it, it might be perfectly happy with the situation. So one day it's quite warm, and I had time to play with them, and I set up a little paddling pool in the garden, and we had a little game where you can run around, and the running around included running through this little paddling pool, and both children enjoyed that. And then we extended it to moving the slide, and so they would slide down the slide and slide into the paddling pool and then run around. And very simple game. So with both of them, they enjoyed this game very much. They slipped down the slide into the paddling pool and continued running around. And then that evening, instead of my wife taking him directly up to bath or trying to force him to bath, because I think it was a Sunday when they have their baths, I ran the bath for him, and he wasn't in the bathroom at this time, so I brought him in and described to him what I was doing, and I was saying, okay, we're going at the top of the slide, and we're sliding down into the water, because the bath has an incline like most baths, and it has a slide to it. And he slid down the bath and into the water, and there was absolutely no problem with it whatsoever. He was just acting as if he'd never had any rejection of water and being in the bath at all. And I think you could put this down to just his orientation and how he was seeing the situation. I wouldn't describe that as an experimental situation, but just as an anecdote to say how you as a parent, you could just enter into these things. You don't need to read all the theory that Vygotsky puts together in order to just appreciate that you've probably saved yourself more angst by just encouraging this different perspective on things. Okay, so a little bit more about refusing things. Children refusing, for example, to go to bed. I think many parents probably aware of, maybe they don't think about it too much, but they're aware of the levels of reasoning that a child may go through in certain activities. So when a child says, when a child starts to put up resistance because it's bedtime, they're not necessarily going to just put their foot down and say, no, I'm not going to bed. It's because, they want to go and do something else. Now, when you've got, depending on the age of the children, there's a general simple method that you can sometimes apply, and that is you frame it in the right way. And one of these would be, for example, instead of saying, okay, it's time to go to bed, you can say, well, it's getting towards bedtime. What are we going to do first? Are we going to brush your teeth, or are we going to put your pajamas on? And depending on where the child is in their developmental phases, they're not necessarily going to say, we're not going to do either. We're not going to bed at all. They're not going to come up with that response. It's the way they're thinking and is going to be quite concrete in terms of which of the two options do I go for. And particularly, you might say, even with smarter, kids that are a bit older, intellectually, they might. You have to bear in mind that by the end of the day, they're getting quite tired, and I would suggest it's a very good idea to just lower the involvement or complexity of tasks that your child engage with right towards the end of the day. Otherwise, you're going to end up with probably more tantrums than you necessarily want to entertain. So this would now many parents be aware of this. You could phrase things in a particular way. Depending on the age, you might have to get more sophisticated in how you structure these things. But certainly for quite young children, you could say, okay, do you want to brush your teeth first, or do you want to get your pajamas on? And immediately the child feels that they have an option. They go and do things, and they have some agency in what's going on, and they will pick one or the other. And you can slowly make your way eventually towards them actually, going to bed, and you get some well-earned rest as a parent too. That, I think, you can think of that as an example of getting a sort of slightly different example of the parent-child engagement. As you can almost think of it as an interface, as a certain level of influence and guidance and communication. So obviously, as the child gets more sophisticated, there might be more sophisticated ways. Gets old enough, and they can, they choose for themselves when they go to bed, within reason. So now that kind of refusal or rejection is not necessarily the same as the prior kind, but there's a similar kind of method that you can apply in terms of understanding the orientation that the child is taking. Now, this makes it easier for you as an adult in the sense that there's less confrontation, perhaps, but it's certainly not easier in terms of the attention that is required for you as an adult. So these practices as an involvement as an adult is going to require more involvement, particularly at the times when the child themselves starts to get tired and fussy, or show annoyance and this sort of things. When those, so this we're talking about generally towards the end of the day. In the evening time, the child themselves are getting tired. They themselves probably don't realize that they're getting tired. They're probably still trying to do the things that they were doing in the middle of the day, but it's not working because they're tired, and be showing some degrees of frustration as well. So when we come back to the parent as an auxiliary mind, at these times you're doing more of the carrying. So you're where the harmony interface and or whatever you want to call it, the communication that you had earlier in the day is not going to be the same that it is when they're getting tired, and you're providing more support, perhaps, but also more tolerance too. Hopefully this is making sense. Last thing to make note of especially towards evening time, one of the things I tried with my children is to encourage more self-awareness of their own tiredness, and so I would reiterate daily, choose something simpler towards the end of the day. I mean, we had numerous experiences of children crying, what have you, towards the end of the day, because they're trying to do things that they could do earlier in the day, but they were just, mentally tired from the day's activities, but not themselves realizing it. And so starting with just directing them to do simpler things in the last hour of the day, but also encouraging them to be aware that this was happening. And I'd say that with the older child, this has generally worked, and that he picks his activities a bit more judiciously now. I'm not sure we have that problem with the younger child either. Yeah, so the nature of the parenting challenges changes. Okay, last page. Right, got a note here. Parental values and the school curriculum. Expectancies around school. Okay, so this is getting much more into developmental education side of things. Generally, I would say I have reasonably low expectations of what to expect from school, or really the school curriculum, which is outside the control of the school. My wife probably has higher expectations, but these expectations are more in line with how the curriculum should be implemented within the school, and that all the work that children do should be covered on regularly, and they should be listening to the child reading, and basically the teachers should be doing all the diligence that certain parents like my wife think they should be doing, and often that they don't quite meet her criteria. So where I sit with this is much more a case of, well, what can the school achieve? What are their goals? What are they trying to meet? And I just work within those expectations, and just try to fit in, really, and say, well, how can I as a parent bring all these other factors into play that the school aren't providing, that I myself value and think are very important. And so unless I was to start up my own developmental educational school or find one, my own values are ones that are going to have to play in tandem with what's presented in the school environment. And then I myself came up through what's called a comprehensive school in the UK, and I feel that cognitively speaking, I've done reasonably well, and so just because the school system that we go to isn't necessarily tailored for developmental education, that doesn't mean that the process can't still take place. I think it just requires particular onus and effort to make sure that it takes place. Okay. Right, so particular kinds of things that I would encourage the children to do when they're outside of school that would exercise certain cognitive competencies that they wouldn't necessarily be getting in school. So just getting them I'd encourage them to get involved in certain projects. So this is something that they might be involved in with for an hour a day, or maybe just half an hour. Sometimes longer. But basically everything of their own choice and volition. And the projects would be things that they enjoyed doing, but would demand a certain degree of attention from them, which I think was, that'd be part of the enjoyment of what they were doing. Exercising their reasoning. This could happen through puzzles that I would give them, games, could be like board games. They both play chess, and I've shown them some things this summer. Actually, I made a little Go board, and we used one of the boys is a big tin of buttons, and we found lots of little white and black buttons to use as the stones, and I showed them how to play Go, and they seem to quite like it, and they just go and play together by themselves sometimes, and just play Go and play chess and card games. There's participation in tasks, so lots of household chores, but also sometimes things that I'm doing, particularly if I'm making something. Then I think it's good that they try and get his hands on it as they can, or just appreciate what I'm doing. So this summer I was completing a little structure in the garden for them. It's basically, it started off as a sand pit, and there's like a tower over this, and I was putting a shelter over the tower, and getting them involved in building the shelter. So yes, the participation in tasks, and a fair bit of self-study as well, and getting them used to being able to learn on their own. A good bit of this is just reading activities, and they're both quite good readers now, probably better than I was at this age. And just general activities that a parent would be interested in, cycling and swimming and this sort of thing. So on a nice day, if we're around on the weekend, we might go for a family cycle ride, which avoiding any roads, and they're all on their own bikes now, but that took a long time. Originally they were on seats on the back of the bikes and pull-tos and things, and so it's a natural progression. Interestingly, that the second child is much more, you might say, fluent in moving skills, kinetic skills, you might say. Although he showed a great, fluency with cycling, he decided that he wasn't going to be, cycling on his own bike until I think it might have been getting close to 5. He had a balance bike for a long time. I think he had the balance bike when he was about 3, and enjoyed it, but didn't want to leave that for a bike without the a bike where you've got pedals, for a good while. Although from a parent perspective, you could say, well, he's more fluent than many children with these kind of things. You're quite sure that he would enjoy getting on a bike and cycling, but he chose that he wasn't going to do it, and it was just waiting for the right moment or the right time for that to happen. And eventually, I think he was about 5 years old, I think, and there's one time we say, it seemed the timing was right, and I said, okay, we're going to go and practice some cycling. And for about 2 weeks, I would take him out, and I would jog beside him once he was, it didn't take him very long at all to get his balance properly. And I'd just go jogging, and we'd do maybe about a mile a day, something like that, until for about 2 weeks. And he just picked it up very, very quickly. But as a parent, you could see, well, you were sure, yeah, it's a certain bet that he would pick it up quickly. But he'd made emotionally he was attached to the previous way of doing things, and there was no reason to push it. So you could just say, well, okay, in your own time, when you're ready, we'll get on with it. And once he'd made that transition to being able to cycle on his own, then of course, as a family unit, we could then enjoy certain trips together. And again, it's about the togetherness of that. I think you can make quite a strong connection between the free enjoyment in activities and the kind of free creative imagination that you can bring to many encounters too. Probably don't have much time to go into that, but when we're talking, other than saying, when I'm talking about cognition here, I'm not necessarily talking about that degree of free emotional cognition, free emotional creation. The kind of cognitive structures that I get into in some of the things that I've written about, you think of that as basically an articulated framework of understanding things or being able to explain things and work with things. It's not necessarily the same thing as getting some imaginative insight into something. But even if one got some sort of insight, in order to explain it or even work with it, remember it, you would start to have to bring these cognitive structures to bear upon it. So you can think of the kind of cognitive structures as a kind of filter, and but also a way of manipulating things. How articulated your ability to manipulate ideas are, and also the ideas of one's own activity. How you can build your own strategy for undertaking a task. Right. Yeah, so all these activities, you might think there's nothing particularly special about them, and I'd say, yeah, they're just everyday things. They're just given a particular onus, but a particular focus. I would say with all of these things, there's an underlying consideration that problems are good. Thinking problems, or you're faced with a task and you hit an obstacle. This is a certain kind of material you can think of. You can think of these problems as a kind of food to encourage independent thinking. So yeah, I'm not shy of just throwing new things at the kids if I think that they'll enjoy them. Right, got a note here about alternative schooling. So this is something always at the back of my mind, is about, well, are they getting the best kind of education that for them, or is there a better way? And I suppose I explored this a little bit with the COVID conditions, in that I was providing teaching for them for about 16 weeks up until the holidays, summer holidays. So from March till about July, I was providing teaching for them, and this was started off quite extemporary, and I was just building up on my, working my own experiences where I've provided tutorage, and but trying to bring in more of the developmental principles into the experience. I was doing this for the morning, so basically from about 9 o'clock till 1 o'clock, and then my wife would take over, and if there was school work to be done, which there was, but not a huge amount, they would do that within the second session in the afternoon. So I was free in my first session just to focus on lots of different topics, and we would focus much more in depth on particular subjects, and our approach would be noticeably different too. Obviously, if you only got 2 children in your classroom, then you can do things in a very different way. Some of it was pre-planned, but I also like to demonstrate my own thinking, ways of doing things to them. And so whenever I hit a problem or a little issue with what I was trying to show and get them involved in, that would become part of the practice, is actually seeing someone else hit an issue and try to resolve it. But I think there's a lot of content that I could articulate about what I was trying to do in that period, but it would take a long time to get through. There were certain kind of influences. There's developmental education side of things, and the key point about developmental education really is you want to try and, within the Vygotsky and Davidov and within the Davidovian school, a key thing is to try and facilitate the orientation of the child into with respect to the activity. So the big difference between a notational understanding about something and an actual oriented, engaged understanding in which you have to construe the nature of the problem or the objects that might make up the problem. And basically you can achieve this through just the encountering of certain kinds of problems and your focus upon them, and you need to resolve them. And yeah, I'm sorry that I can't really go into this in a lot more detail than other than add another hour to the already very long talk. Okay. But things that came into it is developmental education. I'd say the philosophy was coming into it. Systemic understandings. So, for example, the relationship between a verb and a noun, process and structure, operations that take place when you're making mathematical manipulations, what an object is, these sorts of things, all coming into the philosophy side of things, but also systemic appreciations. But bringing them all in at a level where they can actually get a sense of them. Not necessarily fully comprehend them, but to get a sense that they're not foreign. And I think this is an important issue, in that a lot of people think that perhaps that adult content is for adults and you can't really introduce this to children. But I think you can if you're very conscious about the orientation of the child. And this comes back to ideas about the zone of proximal development. And this hopefully will help to show that the zone of proximal development, as sketched out by Vygotsky, can be thought of as being quite naive, or a little bit naive, because this is quite a flexible, plastic idea or notion in which you can, with care and attention, you can actually bring quite complex ideas, like I'm talking about, philosophical ideas, into the appreciation and awareness of a young child. You can do it. Yeah, it just requires a bit of effort and thinking to do so. All right. So there's philosophy in it, systems ideas. TRIZ came into it. I'm sorry, I can't remember what the TRIZ acronym stands for. It's basically theory of design that relates quite strongly to dialectical processes. So it's, for example, a method of creative design for all sorts of usually engineering apparatus and that sort of thing, but it doesn't have to be. Innovation. And there are people involved in that practice that have got involved in children's education too. So I borrowed some ideas from there, borrowed ideas from my own upbringing and involvement. So there's, sorts of puzzles and things that I got involved with. The mathematics they were doing were 1 or maybe more years ahead of what they were doing in class, and I'd basically bring in anything that was on the periphery of their understanding. So the 9-year-old was doing simultaneous equations and drawing graphs of things. The 6-year-old was doing multiplication, division, working with fractions, things that they wouldn't probably do in school for many years. And it's not necessarily just because, these are things that will be useful to them in the future and they're part of their curriculum, but really it's also about just exercising them. You don't want to be presenting, if you can help it, you don't want to be presenting a child with tasks that they already know how to do. Yeah, so it's about problem-oriented focus, and even when they're not ostensibly faced with a problem of saying, how do I resolve this, you can still exercise that activity by giving them tasks that are new to them and it involve construal. That's quite a big thing for me, so construing things. Okay, that's probably maybe that's sufficient on the alternative schooling. I'll have to go into more detail on that. Perhaps if I follow up on a request from other people that they want more details on, I can go into that. Interestingly, when we finished the school coverage end of July, so we had a rule for the kids, which was basically, it's holiday time, summer holidays. You can do what you like to a certain degree, but we don't want it too noisy in the morning. So you do relatively quiet activities in the morning. And that seemed for them, that pretty much seemed to translate as saying, we just do the sorts of things that we did in Daddy's school, i.e. from 9 till 1, but we kind of choose what to do, choose the curriculum, which for me was like, yeah, great, fine. And so, right the way through the holidays, they've been doing about, a good amount of what they were doing with me, but on their own. Not necessarily the problem-oriented stuff, but the young one has been doing his reading. He reads, I think, at least 2 chapters of his stories. He's got lots of adventure books, and he's, when I say 2 chapters, I don't mean 2 chapters of an adult book. It's smaller, but it's it's a good thing from him to be doing. He's just daily doing it on his own, reading these, and they spend a lot of time at the table reading and writing, making their own stories, making their own little books and ideas. They play, various games together, and and elaborate on certain things. So one of the things they seem to enjoy quite a lot is their own game of Top Trumps. And Top Trumps is a card game where basically you have some topic, and you have each card is an example in this topic. So if it's cars, you've got the fastest car. If it's dinosaurs, you've got the fastest, largest, biggest, scariest dinosaurs, and there are a lot of attributes. And the name of the game is the purpose of the game is you compare your top card with your neighbors, but the person who is leading at that particular in that particular phase of the game chooses the attribute, and if they guess the attribute that's highest for them, they win the card and they carry on playing. So for me, that's, they enjoy the game, and that's fine. It's nice that they create their own game. I can see there's lots of good things about it in terms of their getting greater familiarity with the notion of attributes of things and comparison and modeling. All lots of good things going on there. Other things which I would, I'm sort of more not so enamored, I suppose, about the process is just what you can see as a parent. You can look at this and say, gosh, there is so much detail that they are ploughing into these things, which, you could think of just trivial made up details from stories about lots of different things that they're bringing in, and they're memorizing all of this stuff. And as an adult who, you can, you might think, well, I have to put effort into trying to remember things. You might think, gosh, why couldn't they be spending that time, learning a foreign language or something of similar ostensible merit, where they're harnessing some building a reservoir of familiarity with something that will be of great use to them in the future, rather than this apparent trivia about stories that have been made up, names that have been made up, and you think, they're spending hours and hours on this stuff. Couldn't they be learning some foreign language? And this, I suppose, is partly, you could demonstrate that this is maybe where some leniency, more leniency is required. And giving it in this area, in that we need to just give account for just how long these processes can take, and just how much grounding in these building blocks is required to get the kinds of fluency and enjoyment with more richer activities. And I from a different perspective, I can look at this and say, well, when their experience of these activities is that that for them that it's simple, and for them when it's trivial, they will surely get bored of it, and they will want to move on to something else, or they will want to enrich the process. And as an adult, as a parent, I could I'm tempted to think about, well, there's ways that I could enrich that game, or make a suggestion to them in that game. But it's their own game. I don't need to, it's for them to decide these things. But just as an instance, for example, in of how you might introduce structure into that sort of game when you're thinking about a parent, well, it is that there's simple things. For example, you can change the nature of the structure of the game, which you would have if you were thinking about any kind of game. You'd think about, how do I make a rich structure out of it? And for example, you could say, well, in this circumstance of top trumps, you can introduce a third dynamic or process, for example, that instead of the players themselves choosing which attribute counts, you have some independent process which dictates which attribute is of importance at that particular time, which makes a more interesting structure. And you have to involve the strategy of the thinking more, in terms of, I know that, for example, if ferocity is the current most important attribute, and I know that speed is coming up in 2 turns time, then I can structure my choice of cards in a particular way, assuming you change the rules about necessarily going through a linear process of the cards. And it's those sorts of things, I think, that where again it's like you're looking at the structure of the activity and the structure that the child can bring to the activity and appreciation, anticipation of it, that is all contributing towards that cognitive reorganization, which I think is very important. Okay, just check my notes so I haven't got anything else that of import. Right, that's everything. Hopefully reasonably coherent and equally balanced. I'm not sure of the last one. It does strike me that perhaps I haven't emphasized sufficiently that role about metacognition and the parent. It's quite a lot of nuances to it, so it might benefit from being a talk in its own right. And this talk is already an hour and a half, so let me know what you think, and I'll go from here. Bye now.